They were buried in unmarked graves, scattered across the American wilderness, their names erased from official records. For decades, no one spoke of them. No one asked questions. It was as if they never existed. But they did exist. They were real men, flesh and blood, with families waiting for them on the other side of the world. They were Russian prisoners of war, and America tried to make the world forget they ever set foot on American soil. This is their story. The year was 1945. The world had just emerged from the most devastating war in human history. Millions were dead, cities lay in ruins, and in the chaos of victory, something dark was happening in the shadows. American soldiers were discovering prison camps across Europe. Inside these camps were not just Allied prisoners, but also enemy combatants, Germans, Italians, Japanese, and among them, Russians. But here's where the story gets strange. These weren't Soviet soldiers fighting for Stalin. They were something else entirely. They were men caught in the middle of history's most brutal conflict, men who had been forced to make impossible choices. Some had been captured by the Germans early in the war, starving in Nazi camps, facing death by disease or execution. They were given a choice: fight for Germany or die. It wasn't really a choice at all. To understand how these men ended up in this impossible situation, we need to go back.
Back to the beginning of Operation Barbarossa.
June 22nd, 1941. 3 million German soldiers poured across the Soviet border. It was the largest military invasion in human history. The Soviet forces were caught completely off guard. Stalin had ignored all warnings. He believed Hitler wouldn't break their non-aggression pact. He was catastrophically wrong. In the first weeks of the invasion, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were surrounded and captured. Entire armies, cut off from supply lines, overwhelmed by superior German tactics. The prisoners were marched into hastily constructed camps. There was no food, no shelter, no medical care. The Germans hadn't planned for this many prisoners. They didn't have the resources, and frankly, they didn't care. Soviet POWs were considered subhuman by Nazi ideology. Slavs were seen as racially inferior. Communists were seen as political enemies. The combination was lethal. By the end of 1941, over 2 million Soviet prisoners of war were dead. They died of starvation, exposure, disease, and outright execution. The survivors faced a choice that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. German officers began recruiting among the prisoners. They needed manpower for labor battalions, for auxiliary forces, for units to fight against Soviet partisans. The offer was simple: join us, and you'll get food, you'll get clothing, you'll survive. Refuse, and you'll die in this camp like the thousands before you. Imagine being in that position. You're starving, you've watched your friends die, your body is eating itself, and someone offers you a piece of bread if you just sign your name. What would you do? Some refused on principle. They died with honor, but they died. Others signed. They told themselves it was temporary. They told themselves they would desert at the first opportunity. They told themselves anything to justify survival. Among these men was a Soviet general named Andrei Vlasov. Vlasov had been one of the heroes of the defense of Moscow. He was intelligent, charismatic, a true believer in communism. But when he was captured in 1942, something changed. He had seen the incompetence of Soviet leadership. He had seen his men sacrificed needlessly, and he had heard the stories of what Stalin did to his own people. The purges, the famines, the terror. Vlasov made a decision that would make his name synonymous with betrayal. He agreed to fight against Stalin, not for Hitler. He despised the Nazis, but against Stalin. He envisioned a free Russia, a Russia without communism, a Russia that could rise from the ashes of Soviet tyranny. The Germans allowed him to form the Russian Liberation Army. Thousands of former Soviet soldiers joined. Some were true believers in Vlasov's vision. Others just wanted to survive. They wore German uniforms with Russian insignia. They carried weapons. They fought, though often reluctantly, against partisan forces and in rearguard actions. But here's the crucial thing to understand. Most of these men never wanted to fight for Germany. They were trapped between two totalitarian regimes, both of which would kill them without hesitation. As the war turned against Germany, as the Red Army pushed westward, these men knew their time was running out. They couldn't surrender to the Soviets. That was certain death. Their only hope was to surrender to the Americans or British, Western forces, democratic nations, nations that believed in due process and human rights. Surely, they thought, surely the Americans would understand. They were wrong. When American forces swept across Germany in the final months of the war, they encountered thousands of these Russian soldiers, men in German uniforms, speaking Russian, claiming they were forced to fight. The American soldiers didn't know what to do with them. This wasn't covered in their training. These men were technically enemy combatants, but they were citizens of America's ally, the Soviet Union. So the question went up the chain of command, all the way to the top. And at the top, in February 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met at Yalta. The Yalta Conference was supposed to determine the shape of the post-war world, how Germany would be divided, how Eastern Europe would be governed, how peace would be maintained. But buried in the agreements was a clause that would seal the fate of these Russian prisoners. Article 3 of the Repatriation Agreement stated clearly, all Soviet citizens found in the zones of Allied occupation were to be handed over to Soviet authorities. No exceptions, no appeals, no consideration of individual circumstances. Stalin insisted on this. He viewed anyone captured by the enemy as a traitor. Surrender was treason. Collaboration was unforgivable. Roosevelt and Churchill agreed. They needed Stalin's cooperation for the post-war order. They needed Soviet forces to help finish the war against Japan. A few thousand Russian prisoners seemed like a small price to pay. But for those men, it was a death sentence. When word spread through the camps that they were being sent back to the Soviet Union, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Panic, terror, desperation. Some prisoners slit their wrists. Others tried to hang themselves. A few attacked the guards, knowing they would be shot, preferring a quick death to what awaited them in Russia. American soldiers watched in horror. These were supposed to be the good guys. They had just defeated fascism. They were liberators, heroes. But now they were being ordered to hand over terrified men to a regime that would torture and kill them. One American officer wrote in his diary, "I feel like I'm working for the Gestapo. These men are begging for their lives, and we're sending them to their deaths. This isn't what I fought for." But orders were orders. The forced repatriation began in the spring of 1945. Thousands of Russian prisoners were loaded onto trains and ships. Many were bound and gagged. Some were beaten into submission. British forces in Austria encountered particularly fierce resistance. At one camp, Russian prisoners barricaded themselves inside. When British soldiers tried to force them out, the Russians fought back with makeshift weapons. The British opened fire. Several prisoners were killed. The rest were subdued and shipped east. There's a famous photograph from this period. It shows a young Russian man, maybe 20 years old, being dragged by two American soldiers. His face is contorted in anguish. Tears stream down his cheeks. His mouth is open in a scream. Behind him, other prisoners are being loaded onto a truck. Some have their hands over their faces. Others stare at the camera with empty, defeated eyes. That photograph was classified for decades. The military didn't want the American public to see what was being done in their name. Most of the prisoners were sent to Soviet reception camps. These weren't liberation centers. They were interrogation facilities. SMERSH, the Soviet counterintelligence agency, was waiting. Their name literally meant death to spies. Their job was to root out traitors, real or imagined. Every returned prisoner was interrogated. For days, for weeks. The questions were relentless. Why were you captured? Why didn't you fight to the death? Who else collaborated? What did you tell the Germans? What did you tell the Americans? The interrogators weren't looking for truth. They were looking for confessions. And they got them. Under torture, under threat of harm to their families, under sheer exhaustion, men confessed to crimes they didn't commit. They named names of others. They signed documents. The lucky ones were sentenced to 10 years in the Gulag, hard labor in Siberia, starvation rations, brutal conditions. Many didn't survive. The unlucky ones were executed immediately, a bullet to the back of the head, buried in unmarked mass graves. General Vlasov himself was captured by Soviet forces. He was brought back to Moscow, tortured, put on trial in a secret proceeding, and on August 1st, 1946, he was hanged. His execution was never publicly announced. For decades, the Soviet government denied it had even happened. Vlasov simply disappeared, just like thousands of his men. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn, because not all of these prisoners were sent back to the Soviet Union. Some never left American custody, and some never left American soil. During the war, the United States held over 400,000 prisoners of war in camps across the country. Most were German and Italian, but mixed among them were Russians. The official records are vague about exactly how many. Some documents say hundreds, others suggest thousands. These men were kept separate from the other prisoners. They were housed in isolated barracks. They had limited contact with guards. They were, for all intents and purposes, invisible. Why were they brought to America in the first place? The official explanation is that they were brought over for interrogation. Intelligence officers wanted to learn about Soviet military capabilities, about the Red Army's strengths and weaknesses, about Stalin's intentions. Remember, even before the war ended, tensions were rising between the United States and the Soviet Union. The seeds of the Cold War were already being planted. Former Soviet soldiers, especially officers, had valuable information that could help America prepare for the next conflict. But interrogation doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain why some of these men were held for months, even years. It doesn't explain the secrecy, and it certainly doesn't explain the graves. Let's talk about Camp Rustin in Louisiana. During the war, it held over 4,000 German prisoners. But according to some accounts, it also held a smaller group of Russians. These men were kept in a separate compound. Local residents remember seeing them during work details. They looked different from the Germans. They seemed more frightened. One woman, who was a young girl at the time, remembers her father talking about the special prisoners. He worked as a guard at the camp. He told her that some of the men spoke Russian, that they were terrified of being sent back to Russia. And then one day, they were gone. All of them. The barracks were emptied overnight. Her father never spoke of them again. When she asked, years later, he became agitated. "Forget about them," he said. "They're gone. That's all you need to know." Where do they go? Similar stories come from other camps. Fort Dix in New Jersey, Camp Shanks in New York, Camp McCain in Mississippi. In each case, there are accounts of Russian prisoners, and in each case, those prisoners vanish from the official records. Some veterans claim the men were deported in secret, special flights in the middle of the night, no documentation, no witnesses. But others tell a different story, a darker story. One former guard, speaking on condition of anonymity in the 1990s, described something he witnessed at a camp in upstate New York. He was on night duty. Around 2 in the morning, he heard trucks arriving. He went to investigate and was told to return to his post, but curiosity got the better of him. From a distance, he watched as prisoners were loaded onto the trucks. They were Russian prisoners. He recognized them from their compound. The men were docile, quiet, almost drugged. The trucks drove toward the back of the camp, toward an area that was off-limits to most personnel, an area that backed onto dense forest. He heard the trucks return a few hours later, empty. The next day, when he asked about the Russian prisoners, he was told they had been transferred. When he asked where, he was told it was classified. But no transfer orders were ever filed, no transportation logs, nothing. "I think they buried them in the woods," he said decades later. His voice was shaking. "I think they killed them and buried them, and I think I was supposed to forget I ever saw anything." Is this story true? It's impossible to verify. The man is dead now. The camp has long since been closed and the land redeveloped. But there are other stories, other witnesses, other pieces of the puzzle. In 1987, a construction crew in Pennsylvania uncovered skeletal remains while excavating for a new housing development. The site was near a former POW camp.